everyone, I am Shania May Javier from BSU 1-7. So for today's video, I will be your lecturer. So for today's lecture, I have here two topics: the differential coercion theory and the control balance theory. Well, let's discuss first the differential coercion theory. This theory is theorized by Mark Colvin in 2000. Unfortunately, I failed to find his portrait. Nonetheless, he is a sociology professor in Mexico, where he developed this theory. In some resources, it is said that Mark Colvin's theory is actually based on the riot that happened in New Mexico prison. It is actually believed that many people have died along with the guards due to the unfair treatment and inhuman treatment. This riot resulted into a devastating casualties that is actually considered as the worst or most violent prison riot in U.S. history, giving birth to the study of differential coercion theory. Now let's go back to the topic. The DCT, or the differential coercion theory, outlines the relationship between coercion and crime. And Colvin's research expanded on his previous work in an attempt to increase our grasp of the coercion-crime relationship. In his first understanding, coercion comes from a variety of sources, including families, friends, schools, neighborhoods, and surroundings. For now, let's define the terms that Mark Colvin has used in his theory. He used the term differential due to the indication that individuals don't have the same exposure to coercion. And the coercion means forcing someone to do or something bad in a form of intimidation or violence. Now, Colvin posits two dimensions of coercion. First is the degree of coercion, and the second one is the consistency of coercion. Alright, let's talk about the first one. The first one pertains to the level of experience of being a subject to coercion. For example, whether if a person experienced the coercion lightly or heavily, with a range of non-coercive to strongly coercive. The latter one, or the second one, is the consistency of coercion. This pertains to the frequency of a person being a subject to coercion. Like, for example, Mr. A is verbally abused and violence is a normal life basis for him, while Mr. B have many friends, but his family doesn't recognize him. When he is in school, he felt happiness, but when at home, he felt isolated. It is also said the extent of consistency of coercion is the most salient element in producing delinquency. Let's move on. The term coercive ideation refers to the concept of the world is full of coercive forces and it can only be overcome through coercion. I can somehow relate to the Tagalog sayings that kung anong tinanim, siya rin ang aanihin, whether it is the other people who planted the seed or the victim themselves. Given for the example of when a kid is being abused and tormented at home, kid will also most likely to bully someone in the school, since what comes into his mind is if you are strong, then you can defeat someone who is looking down on you. And in order to prove that you're strong, then you have to resort to bullying the weak ones. It's kind of simple. This set of social psychological deficits such as high anger, low self-control, withdrawn social bonds, and coercive ideation gives way to the relationship of coercion and delinquency. Well, Colvin also differentiates the types of coercion, namely the interpersonal or direct and the impersonal or the indirect coercion. The interpersonal force comes from the direct relations of control in various settings like the family. That's the number one. In this type of micro-level coercion, it uses threats of force for intimidation to comply on something, while the impersonal forms of indirect coercion of control is beyond individuals' control. This type of coercion can be experienced due to the economic and social pressures created by poverty, or violence. Competition among groups. This also includes the street gangs rivalries. You can also include the bullying that happened to some schools. Next is the DCT, just like what I said earlier about the two-dimensional coercion. The degree of coercion ranging from non-coercive to highly coercive, and the consistency, whether the coercion is experienced consistently or not, or the erratic basis. And there are 4 types of coercion that was derived on the study of crime and coercion. Type 1. Type 1 is the consistent non-coercive. These are actually the people who are loved by the world. Hindi po mapapasana on ka na lang talaga. And this type, people who does not experience coercion are less likely to be involved in criminality. They can develop control and are expected to display pro-social behavior. Next one is the type 2. Type 2 is erratic non-coercive. Being this type of individual subjected in this group can experience the feeling of uncertainty or unreliability since the social support is delivered inconsistently. Although there is no coercion model involved here, at this level, the individual may be more likely to involve in non-violent crime or victimless crime. For example, Mr. A cannot feel the love of his family. Thus, he relied on his friend, which is somehow a bad influence. One day, he was invited to a party and his friend gave him a dare that would actually cost his life. However, in order to feel accepted, he still did it and it actually cost his life. Now, type 3 is the consistent coercive. In this level, the individuals subjected to this are more likely to develop a psychopathological problems as a result of inward anger, helplessness, fear, and depression. They may not be involved in chronic criminality, they can still create violent random offenses like homicides or assaults as a result of their psychopathology. Some individuals have these called anger issues. They could not contain the anger of being provoked, especially if it hit their traumas. They might resort by killing a person and intentionally be carried away by their emotions. Then the last type is the erratic coercive. In this type, coercion punishment as form of discipline can be associated in controlling of one's behavior. This limits the social support that needs to have, especially to have a strong social bond in society. This level might actually cause a serious psychological deficit, where it is predicted that people who are subjected in this type of control are more likely to be involved in predatory crimes. Now, let's proceed to the next topic. The control balance theory. This control balance theory is actually proposed by Charles R. Title. He is a sociology professor at Washington State University at Pullman. In this theory, I will be discussing 2 parts. First is the original theory that was published in 1995 and the revised theory in 2004. In the original theory, deviance is defined as any behavior that the majority of a given group regards as unacceptable or that typically evokes a collective response of a negative type. Okay. In short, it is behavior that does not conform to the standard of social norms. Moving on, deviance was divided into 6 parts. First is depredation. It is defined as direct acts, including physical violence, manipulation, and anything that does not care the victim's well-being. Second is the exploitation, which means indirect predation. Moving on to the third one is the defiance, which means the indifference of an individual to another. Fourth is plunder, pursuit of one's own goals with little regards to one's action. The fifth is decadence. This actually deals with the unpredictable and impulsive acts. And lastly, submission, which totally means passive obedience towards others. Like if Mr. A was ordered to give his money to the bullies, he will give it, because if he don't, he will be done for. The original theory also talks about the control imbalances. This is considered the most crucial idea in the theory, not just for driving deviant conduct, but also for trying into the specific form of deviance that an individual engages in. Control imbalances can manifest as either surplus or deficits. Let's talk about it. Okay, let's talk about the surplus. Both has distinct concepts. In surplus, the subject has more control than being controlled, meaning the constraints in the environment has no way of stopping this individual. Thus, the predicted behavior will only be autonomous. While opposite to that, deficit, the subject is being controlled than he or she exercises. Thus, the predicted behavior is related to repressive acts. This type of individual has self-control to deviate himself from doing wrong. Next one is, so in here we can conclude that in original theory, those who wield the most control and those who have the least control are proposed to be the ones most likely to engage in deviant acts. Now let's proceed to the next part of the theory. Since the original theory is way too complex and it is hard to comprehend, says the critic. Under finding the control balance, Charles R. Title addresses some of the issues that are said hard to explain even with empirical tests. First is the inconsistent conceptualizing of seriousness. In this case, seriousness was presented as a constraint. However, both of the terms have different concepts from each other. He clarifies seriousness as a feature of deviant acts, implying their potential for arousing counter-control, not a simply cognitive judgment about the consequences or the wrongness of an act. Second is the qualitative distinction of seriousness. I have tackled about the surplus and deficits in the original theory. If it is surplus, then the predicted outcome is autonomous, and if it is deficits, then it is predicted to be repressive. However, direct tests absolutely says that the control surplus or control deficit tended to be associated with deviance, regardless whether it is repressive or autonomous. Thus, this concept is abandoned in the Rice theory of 2004. Next is their conceptualizing of submissive acts. Their fine theory now attempts to explain conformity and deviance outcomes of control balancing as well as submission as a failure of control balance. Finally, departing from the original presentation of deviance typology in favor of the control balance desirability. In other source, it is actually called the single continuum of deviance. And for the most part, control balance theory still operates as originally proposed when a situational provocation that arouses the individual's intention with humiliation requires some corrective or rebalancing behavior. However, in the revised theory proposed that depending on the control balance desirability is a type of deviance will be employed. So the control balance desirability goes like this. Okay, in persons ratio, this refers to the motivation towards the deviance act. And in order to carry out the act, there must be an opportunity. How can someone act if there is no such thing as opportunity? Next is constraint. This reflects the magnitude of the counter-controlling consequences or an actual chance of experiencing counter-control. And last is the desire, which is the decision-making of a person whether to be controlled or to control. In here, the revised theory recognizes that not everyone is actually rational. And title says that actually the outcome expected from the theory will vary with the self-control of a person. Well, that would be all. Thank you for listening.